Hello and welcome everyone to my Secret of the Old Clock comparison video. I'm really looking forward to doing this comparison because I'm going to be looking at not just one, two, or even three books, but four. In case you weren't aware, yes, Secret of the Old Clock is inspired by four different titles, the first four Nancy Drew books, in fact. And I'm making an assumption that the game is based off of the revised versions of the stories. I don't have the originals to make that comparison, but certainly the storylines of the revised editions fit very well with the game. So, what are those titles, you might be wondering? So, we have, of course, The Secret of the Old Clock, our title for the game, The Hidden Staircase, The Bungalow Mystery, and The Mystery at Lilac Inn. And elements from all four books were merged to create the game Secret of the Old Clock. So, as I already noted, this to me is very exciting. I had a lot of fun reading the books and picking out all the great details that were taken from a book and put into the game. And they're done really well, and you'll discover that as I point them out. And before I start that, I should, of course, give a spoiler alert. I'm going to mention culprits and details to some degree of the storylines. I'm going to be a little bit quicker and not go through as many details because I'm going through four books and a game rather than just one book and one game. So I'm just going to go over sort of the bare bones. And then after that, I will do the actual comparisons, which will be done slightly differently than in previous videos. Normally, I mention an element from a book and how that's done in the game. In this instance, I'm going to mention something from the game because that's sort of my basis for everything. And then note the single book, or in some cases, multiple books, where that element was taken from. So let's begin. Starting with, of course, the first book. This is The Secret of the Old Clock, which is originally written in 1930. Again, I'm making the assumption that this is a revised version that they're basing the game on. So this book was revised in 1959. So in the story, we have Nancy, who makes some new friends. She meets these new people after an incident, and they discover that they've been robbed. So Nancy feels really bad for these women, and through this she also learns that they had expected to inherit some money after a gentleman named Josiah Crowley had died. Instead, the Tophams, who are family members of his, received everything according to his will. And Nancy meets many other people who also had this expectation that they would inherit something from Josiah. And she begins to wonder, could there be a second will? And as she investigates, her path crosses that of the thieves that had sort of been noted earlier. And she kind of knows who they are because she kind of had a run-in with them just before she met the Turners, and those are the new acquaintances mentioned above. So there are many characters in this book, and this really helps to substantiate Nancy's belief that there could be a second will. You have so many people claiming that Josiah told them that they would inherit when he passed. She really thinks they're probably not all lying. There could be another will, and this is really what gets Nancy involved in her first ever mystery. So our characters include Mary and Edna Turner. Those are those acquaintances she first met, and young Judy, who I'm giving the last name Turner. She's not actually a blood relation. The sisters are raising her. They'd actually raised her mother, who had recently passed away, so they've now taken in her young daughter. And they are relations of Josiah. And then we have Grace and Allison Hoover, who are not relatives, but were friendly with the gentleman. Fred and William Matthews, who are cousins of some sort to Josiah. Abby Rowan, she and her husband had taken care of Josiah at one point. And then we have Mr. and Mrs. Richard Topham and their daughters, Ada and Isabel, who are, again, actual relatives of Josiah. And then Sid Sachs, Jake, and Parky. Jake and Parky don't have last names noted in the book, so that's why they're not included. And they are some of our baddies in the book. So Nancy winds up discovering this hidden notebook in a clock that Josiah had owned that had this crescent moon on it. And just a little side note, this clock was kept at a cottage on Moon Lake. And of course, anyone who's played Ghost Dogs Moon Lake will kind of know what I'm talking about, why that was an interesting note. And so this notebook, anyhow, that she finds in the clock leads her to the second will. Now, for anyone who kind of understands how wills work, you have to have them signed and witnessed. So you might be wondering, well, wouldn't people have noted or mentioned, well, we know there was another will. We witnessed it. It turns out that the two witnesses to that will had died before Josiah did, and that's why there was never anyone who, sort of raised their hand and said, there's another will, a more current will, that distributes the estate differently. So that's why it wasn't, no one knew about it, because the only ones who did had already passed away. So along with the discovery of this will, the crooks are captured, and Josiah's friends inherit rather than the Tophams, although Richard Topham does inherit a small amount. So that's the gist of the first book, The Secret of the Old Clock. Now we'll look at the second story, which is The Hidden Staircase. This one was also revised in 59. So Nancy and her newly engaged friend Helen Corning are invited, or rather, Helen invites Nancy to Twin Elms to help solve the mystery of a haunting. So Twin Elms is owned by some of her relatives, and there have been some strange events, furniture moving and theft of some jewelry, and they're wondering what's going on. And Helen knew of Nancy solving her first case, and she sort of thinks, well, maybe you could solve a second one. And while Nancy's away at Twin Elms, her father is kidnapped. So we've got two things going on. She's worried about her dad, and she's trying to find clues to his kidnapping, while simultaneously searching for these clues at Twin Elms to explain the ghost. And she has a suspicion that there must be a passageway, because how else is someone getting into the house when the doors and windows are locked? So who are our characters? Well, of course, we have Helen Corning. Again, this is a friend of Nancy's. She's a few years older than her. We have Helen's aunt, Rosemary Hayes, and her grandmother, Miss Flora Turnbull. And everyone just calls her Miss Flora. And then we have Nathan Gomber, who's more involved with Carson's case, as well as Willie Wharton. So we think. We initially think they're just related to what Carson's got going on. But Nancy, in the end, discovers that Nathan Gomber is actually behind both crimes. He is responsible for kidnapping Carson, and he, with Willie, sort of acted as the ghost at Twin Elms. Willie was not exactly a willing participant. He quite quickly gives up and is like, hey, I don't want to be a participant in this. Let's go nail Nathan, that sort of thing. So that is sort of the gist of The Hidden Staircase. There's actually a lot more to it, but again, I'm kind of going swiftly through these, and if you want to learn more, I suggest picking up a copy of the book. So now let's look at book number 3, The Bungalow Mystery, and this one was revised in 1960. So we have Nancy and Helen again. They are out boating, and when a storm comes up, their boat capsizes, and Laura Pendleton, who they don't know, she's a stranger to them, saves them, and they take shelter in this bungalow. And as they're sort of introducing themselves, Laura explains that her mother's recently passed away, and she's about to meet her new guardians, the Aborns, later that afternoon. And she's really nervous. She's never met them before. They're total strangers to her. So upon meeting the pair, Nancy and Helen are a bit suspicious. They feel like they're disingenuous, that they're putting on sort of a false front. And they'd had sort of run-ins with the guardians on separate occasions, which were not exactly positive experiences. And so they worry about Laura and decide that they're going to visit her once she's sort of settled in with her new guardians. But they never get the chance. Shortly after this, Laura runs away to Nancy's house, and she's worried that there's something really bad basically going on with the Aborns. She thinks they're a bit crooked. So Nancy, of course, volunteers to help find out what's going on. And also her dad asks her to help him with an embezzlement case. She just has to sort of interview some people just to find out a bit about them, see if there's any chance they might be involved. It's initially pretty basic, sort of on the side. So the characters in the book include, of course, Laura Pendleton. So she's the young orphan that the girls meet. We have the supposed Aborns, who are really Alma and Stephen Stumpy Dowd. They're impersonating the Aborns. We have Jim and Kathy Donnell, who are teen siblings who live in the same area as the Aborns, and Nancy encounters them on a few occasions. And then we have the real Jacob Aborn. So he winds up being found. Nancy discovers him in a basement later on. He's been held captive by Stumpy Dowd. And so Nancy winds up learning that the Dowds have impersonated the Aborns in order to swindle Laura of her inheritance. They had intercepted this letter sort of from, I don't know if it was from Laura's mother herself, I can't quite remember who, but sort of requesting that they be the guardians, have to take over because her mom's passed, or was due to pass. And they knew through some of the correspondence that the Aborns were due to be away, so they thought they had time to pull off the scheme. And along with that, this couple is behind another scheme, and that's the embezzlement case that Carson had asked Nancy to help him with. So this really horrible pair of people taking people's money in line. So that's the gist of the Bungalow Mystery. And then our final book, this is book number 4, The Mystery at Lilac Inn, which was revised in 1961. So once again, we have Nancy and Helen. These two are like peas in a pod. They are in the first 4 books. I don't think Helen's actually in the 5th one in any capacity, just in case anyone is curious about that. Yeah, so they've been invited to Lilac Inn by Emily Willoughby, who's a friend of theirs, and they are going to be part of her wedding party. So they're going there a little early to help with the preparations. Emily and her fiance have also just bought Lilac Inn, so it's new to them, and they're doing some renovation work, and there's a lot going on, so it's nice to have her friends come early to help out with the wedding end of things. And while they're on their way to Lilac Inn, Nancy discovers that she has a doppelganger. She and Helen are canoeing along the river. They bump into a friend of theirs, and she mentions, "Oh, how did you get here so quickly, Nancy? I just saw you somewhere else." And Nancy mentions that she wasn't there. This is the first time they've seen each other today, so there's someone who looks a lot like her running around the neighborhood, which is a bit strange and interesting. So when they finally get to Lilac Inn, they learn through Emily that there have been some strange occurrences at the inn. Been some vandalisms, of an employee quit because she claimed the place was haunted. Some strange things. And shortly thereafter, Emily is presented with these diamonds that had been left to her by her deceased mother. And her aunt's about to give them to her when the power goes out. And then the diamonds are stolen. So here's another incident that has occurred at the inn. And of course, Nancy says she's going to investigate. And she winds up tying these incidents at the end with some other strange events that have been occurring along the Muskoka River. And those events I'm not going to get into detail about. Those, again, if you want to read the book, you will then find out what that is. So our characters are Emily Willoughby. So again, this is a friend of Nancy and Helen who's due to be married. Mrs. Hazel Willoughby, who is her aunt. John McBride, who is friends with Emily's fiance, and he's come to help out. Maud Potter, who works at the inn to help with social functions. Gil Gary, who is one of the gardeners. And then Gay Moreau, who we don't actually discover her true name until quite late in the story. She has a few aliases. So in the end, we learn that Gay sought revenge against Carson because he was involved with her imprisonment. And so she impersonated Nancy to get payback, really. And then in addition to this, she and her gang are involved with many recent thefts, including those at Lilac Inn and the strange occurrences on the Muskoka River. So again, all these cases sort of tie back together. That's often what happens in the Nancy Drew books. There may be more than one mystery, but they're related. So there we go. That's the mystery at Lilac Inn. So with that, let's now look at the computer game. This is game number 12, Secret of the Old Clock. So Emily Crandall asks Nancy Drew to visit her in order to keep her jewelry safe. So her late mother has these jewels, and Emily's just a bit worried, and she knows that the Drew home has a safe, so she wants Nancy to take them home with her. But shortly after Nancy arrives, the kitchen catches fire. Everyone has to leave the inn. When they run back inside, Emily discovers that the jewelry has been stolen. Nancy feels really bad for this young woman who's had so much loss recently, and she decides she wants to help. So this is Nancy's introduction, sort of in the original story world of Nancy Drew books. This is her introduction to solving mysteries. Of course, this is game number 12. As players, we've had 11 earlier mysteries, but this is meant to be her introduction to solving mysteries. So as she investigates, Emily also lets her know that she'd expected this inheritance once Josiah Crowley had passed away. He was this neighborly man who came often to the inn and had sort of hinted in not so subtle ways that she and her mother would be well off upon his passing. Instead, his entire estate went to Richard Topham. And Emily's not the only one who'd had this expectation. Jim Archer also mentions that he thought he would be well off once Josiah had passed. He'd anticipated an inheritance, as it were. The characters in the game are Emily Crandall, of course this is who invited Nancy in the first place, Jane Willoughby, who is her new guardian after her mum's recent passing, Richard Toppin, who already mentioned wound up inheriting the entire Crowley estate, and then Jim Archer, who is a banker who is not doing quite as well as he'd like others to believe. And he too thought that Josiah Crowley would have left something in his will. So as Nancy investigates not just the theft of the jewelry and some strange occurrences at the end, like this moving picture in Emily's room, she's also looking into the potential will and sort of digging into Josiah Crowley. And she unearths some puzzles and this set of hidden staircases, which ultimately lead her to finding Josiah's real will. And in addition to this, she learns that Jane is not who she claims to be. So there's our overview of the game Secret of the Old Clock. So now that I've broken down the 5 stories, I'm now going to do the actual comparisons. As noted earlier, this is going to be formatted a little differently than in previous videos, but in many ways it's still sort of the same. So I'm going to start by looking at the title, and I'm looking at the game first for everything. So our game is called Secret of the Old Clock. That obviously comes from book number 1, The Secret of the Old Clock. No mystery there. I will add that I feel that The Mystery at Lilac Inn may have been a more appropriate and accurate title. I just feel like it fits the overall storyline of the game better than Secret of the Old Clock. And I mean, clocks are obviously involved in the game, but it's more than one clock, more than just a single old clock, as the title would have us believe. Whereas if we were to call it The Mystery at Lilac Inn, it really encapsulates the idea that there's a lot going on at the inn, not just about a will, but also what's going on with the guardian and the strange occurrences, like the moving picture and whatnot. So just something I thought I would add. Next, I look at the storyline. And I'm not going to go over the storylines for the books because that's just going to be too much. So start with just the game here. So the storyline for the game is that Nancy's been asked to keep Emily's jewelry safe. These are swiftly stolen, and Nancy investigates the disappearance of the jewelry along with sort of this mystery surrounding Josiah Crowley and a potential second will. The books, we have various elements from the 4 books that are intertwined to form the game's storyline, and that's what we're going to look at next. So this for me is where everything gets really interesting, where I can point out this came from this book and this came from this book, and it's just really fascinating and neat for me. And I'm going to go sort of in order for how the game introduces everything. That just makes a lot of sense to me. So it's not necessarily in order of the books, but in order of events from the game. So we'll start with the invitation to Lilac Inn. So Nancy's been invited by Emily. This comes from book number 4, The Mystery at Lilac Inn, where both Nancy and Helen are invited to the inn by Emily. Obviously in the game, it's just Nancy. So they're very easy. That's where that first part of the game came from, book number 4. So then we have a fear over jewelry. So Emily is concerned about her mom's jewelry. She wants Nancy to put it in the safe at her house. And this actually comes from more than one book. 3 of the 4 involve a very similar storyline. So in book number 2, again, that's the hidden staircase, there's jewelry stolen at Twin Elms by the supposed ghost. In book number 3, Laura, who is the orphan, her mother's jewelry is something she's really worried about having stolen, so she keeps that really close to her. And then in book number 4, we have Emily, who's been bequeathed her late mother's diamonds, which are subsequently stolen, and the insurance policy has recently lapsed. So if we're looking for the most directly similar storyline, it's going to be from number 4, because this, again, is someone who has a parent who's just died, and she has her jewelry, although in the case of the book, they're diamonds. In the game, it's necklaces, rings, bracelets, that kind of thing. And the insurance policy having lapsed happens in both stories. But really, this is a pretty common storyline. 3 of the 4 books, we are a little bit worried about jewelry. So, interesting. And then we'll look at Josiah's so-called false promise and second will. So we note early on, she notes that she'd expected to inherit when he passed away. And this all comes from book number 1, The Secret of the Old Clock. Relations and friends of Mr. Crowley were all told that they would inherit upon his death. However, when his will is found, everything is left to the Tophams. Nancy's search unearths a second hidden will within a clock. Of course, in the game, as already mentioned, there are a bunch of clocks, and they lead to, or they involve clues that lead to the will. And this will that's found leaves very little to Mr. Topham in the book. A small portion, not nothing, a little bit, and then the remainder to his friends. So there's where that part of the storyline comes from. It's from the first book. And then we have the moving picture in Emily's room. And this is sort of a small thing, but it is the way that we connect the second book. In book number 2, we have the hidden staircase that connects Twin Elms and Riverview Manor. So again, Twin Elms is owned by Helen's family. Riverview Manor is a twin to it, but it's dilapidated, it's not owned, it's completely run down. But someone is using this to their advantage. That would be Nathan Gomber and Willie Wharton. And they're using this staircase that they've learned about to enter Twin Elms and to play ghost, to scare the occupants. So you can see how that's sort of connected to the game, although it's just a picture that's moving as far as sort of the ghostly occurrences. And it does connect to the house Topham's living in. So there's our hidden staircase connection. And then the next element, and sort of the final element before we talk about characters specifically, is the idea of an imposter. So at the end of Secret of the Old Clock, we learn that Jane Willoughby is not who she claims to be. Her name's not Jane, it's Marion. She is an imposter, faking being this guardian, this old friend of Emily's mum. And this comes from book number 3, The Bungalow Mystery. The Dowds had intercepted the letter to the Aborns, and they impersonate Laura's future guardians. So there's also very clear cut. That element clearly came from book number 3. So those are sort of the main elements of the storyline. And next I'm just going to talk about the characters. So of course we have Emily Crandall, who's invited Nancy to Lilac Inn. So in the game, her last name is Crandall, but that is not the case for the book or any of the books, because you could say she's inspired by a few characters. I don't know where Crandall came from. It doesn't come from any of the stories. And also in the game, she inherits Lilac Inn after her mother's death. So her character really comes from 2 different books and their characters. So in book number 4, this is the most obvious. That's Emily, same first name, but her last name is Willoughby, which we'll see again in a moment. And rather than inheriting the inn, she and her fiancé bought it, and they're renovating it. Her mother also recently died, so that's the same. And same with book number 3, Laura, who is newly orphaned. Her mother also recently passed away. So sort of that loss of a parent comes from the characters of both of those books. So now we'll look at Jane Willoughby. So in the game, her first name might come from a book. So neither of the imposters is named Jane. However, in book number 1, the Crowleys had a maid whose name was Jane. So there's a chance that that's where her game character name came from. I could be wrong, but I did notice that when I was reading the book. I thought, oh, is that Jane? But the role is very different. She's only mentioned in passing. And then her last name from the game comes from book number 4. It's Emily's last name. Her name is Emily Willoughby. Of course, they changed it to Crandall for the game, but they applied her original last name to Jane, which I thought was interesting. And in the game, she pretends to be an old friend of Emily's mother, and she does this to steal from the unsuspecting girl. That we take from book number 3. The couple, Alma and Stephen Dowd, impersonate Laura's future guardians, the Aborns, and their goal is to steal her inheritance. So Jane is really taken from a couple. They've just turned the couple into one person. And from book number 3. Then we can look at Richard Topham. So in the game, he claims to have psychic abilities, and he lived next door to Josiah, or rather he moved into Josiah's house. I had that wrong in my head initially. And he may or may not, I don't know that this was clarified, but he might have falsified the will. I don't know if we ever get confirmation on that. Did Josiah actually write 2 different wills, or did Topham falsify it? I don't know that that's actually made clear. Anyhow, in the first book, The Secret of the Old Clock, Richard and his family are actually relatives of Josiah, so he's not a stranger to him like he is in the game. There's nothing about psychic nonsense. But they as a family took in Josiah when they were having their own financial difficulties, and their thought is, oh, we'll be great people, we'll be wonderful human beings to this relative, and he will leave us money. That was their thought process. And also in the book, Josiah did write both wills. That's what I've gathered. There's nowhere in the book where they say that the first will was fake. So there's Richard. So in many ways he's the same. It's just that psychic part that's big difference, and being or not being related to Josiah. Then we can look at Jim Archer. So in the game, he is a banker and he pretends that all is well. However, we learn the bank is actually in dire straits. Things are not so great. As to the books, he's not mentioned in the first book, but in books 2 through 4, he is the fiance of Helen Corning. And that's it. That's the only tie-in to Jim. We don't actually ever meet him, as you will, or if you will, in the books. He's away on business. He's just mentioned. So Her Interactive created a character with Jim's name. I guess they just wanted to take someone who comes up often in the books, even just in passing. But the other thing we could make note of is that as far as his storyline about struggling financially, I mean, in book number 1, the Tophams are in financial trouble. So we could say that element from Secret of the Old Clock book influenced that part of the character of Jim Archer in the game. And then the last character I want to talk about is, of course, the lovely Helen Corning, who's only in the books. And that's the only reason I'm bringing this up. She is in all 4 of the books. She is a friend of Nancy, and she's a secondary character in all of the books. But she's ever present. She is sort of Nancy's sidekick in some ways. But there is no mention of her in the game. None whatsoever. Which I remember thinking at the time of, not just of this game, but many of the other games, I was really confounded, I guess, by this and sort of flabbergasted that there was no mention of Helen Corning, who is one of Nancy's closest friends in the first several books. Bess and George come up all the time, but not Helen. Even in the game, Nancy can call Bess and George. They're not mentioned in the first 4 books. So, really weird. I don't understand it. But anyway, I thought that was worth mentioning. And then the last few things I'm just going to mention are just some sort of small elements from the books that are implemented into the game. The first being Titusville, so that's where the game takes place. This comes from book number 1, The Secret of the Old Clock. The Matthews brothers, again, these are cousins of some sort to Josiah. They live in Titusville. That's where that comes from. It's a very small mention. Then dressmaking, so in the game, Gloria Crandall, again, that was Emily's mom. She and Jane Willoughby were dressmakers. This also comes from game number 1, Grace Hoover. So this was a friend of Josiah. She helps a dressmaker, and she makes the clothes that she and her sister wear. So a small detail, but it was still put into the game, which is really cool. Although doing the sewing ourselves was not so cool. That's a pain in the butt. And then the last thing, and I've already kind of mentioned this, is the moon clock. So in the carriage house in the game, there's a clock with moons all over its face. And this also comes from the first book, because the clock that holds Josiah's hidden notebook has a crescent moon on its front. So another small detail, but implemented into the game, which is really cool. So now just to conclude, so the 2005 Her Interactive game, A Secret of the Old Clock, is, in my view, a perfect meld of the 4 stories that it is based off of. And again, those stories are The Secret of the Old Clock, The Hidden Staircase, The Bungalow Mystery, and The Mystery at Lilac Inn. The combination of key plot points, which I've just gone through in detail, as well as small details, again, like the Crescent Moon, Titusville, Twin Elms. If you remember, Twin Elms is a place Nancy can go to briefly in the game for a trivet. And even the carriage house that's mentioned in the hidden staircase, that it's on the property. There's a carriage house in the game. These small details are included, and they all come together to create this really great game. I do think that this game is an example of true craftsmanship, and it's a fantastic reworking of the 4 titles that the game is based on. So there we go, everyone. That is my comparison video for Secret of the Old Clock. I can't say it enough. I had a lot of fun rereading these books and picking out all the details. It really is quite marvelous, just the job that Her Interactive did in combining these stories. And they did a really good job about it. Like, nothing feels out of place. It's very smooth, the integration of all the details. I can't say enough good things about it. I just thought I think it's superb, the whole thing. The game on its own is really great. I really enjoy this game. And again, just the way that Her Interactive put the story together from more than one book is just pretty amazing. I'm going to leave it there. So thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you found it fun. As I keep saying, I certainly did. And I look forward to my next one, whenever that may be. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.